My name is Karen Richard, and by profession I am a doctor, and I specialised in psychiatry, and then I subspecialised in forensic psychiatry. And in 2017 I got a government appointment as the psychiatric specialist member of the Parole Board for Scotland. So I've dealt with conflict in all the different stages of my profession. So in forensic psychiatry, you are dealing with conflict in a variety of different ways. You're dealing with very dangerous and difficult to manage patients or people who've committed offences, and then they might become your patient. Sometimes they've already been a patient of somebody else, and obviously if somebody ends up committing an offence because of their mental disorder, it demonstrates that they're difficult to manage. And so sometimes some of the conflict used to come from that. And then in the mental health tribunal service, my role as a judicial member was to be one of a tribunal, and I would be giving the medical component of that and deciding about whether somebody was to be detained under the mental health legislation in Scotland or not. And so there would be sometimes some conflict within the tribunal if other members of the tribunal didn't agree with you. There would be sometimes conflict with the patient who was being detained by the mental health tribunal because they didn't want to be detained. There might sometimes be conflict with their legal representatives, and there might be conflict with the responsible medical officer for the patient if we weren't granting the order and they felt aggrieved about that. And then in the parole board, there's quite a lot of conflict, but it feels a bit different. It feels a bit more removed. But so we act, the parole board, I'm not entirely sure about the systems of parole in the States, but with us, the parole board is dealing as though it's a court for parole purposes. So we decide about whether somebody gets released or not. So there can be some conflict with the legal representatives for the prisoner if they are very vigorously trying to get somebody released and we decide not to release them. There can be conflict within the tribunal of the board. When you're sitting in groups of 3 and they're always randomised, you're not usually going to be in the same group of 3. It's a bit like cocktails. I mean, they're all different. And so the 3 people will sometimes function in a very different way, even though you can function with one of those individuals in another hearing. So it can be very different, but that can sometimes spawn some conflict. So I'm located in Scotland. The attitude to conflict, I'm not sure that there's a coherent attitude towards conflict. In general, I think most systems are quite keen to take on conflict and deal with it and air it. It's quite funny because we're just a little country, but it's quite a different attitude, I think, from England, where they tend to not like conflict. They like it all sanitised and tidied up. But I think people are a bit more combative, maybe. And so they don't really mind about having conflict. I was sitting on a mental health tribunal and in the west of Scotland. So this guy had moved from the very high tariff sort of intensive care unit where they're quite exact and quite careful about their documentation to a general ward. So we took the oral evidence, and the doctor that was giving the evidence was he was perfectly pleasant. He was really he was just not very focused. He was a bit vague about some of the details. I think he'd only just got the case. I think that he also possibly, on a personal basis, he wasn't maybe one of these really assertive and driven people, and he was kind of unsure about anything. He hadn't made the first detention, so he wasn't necessarily bought into it. But within the written information, the documented information, there was lots about serious risk where this patient when unwell, had badly assaulted people, had committed other offences, had done other things that were dangerous, like driven his car when he was psychotic and driven on the wrong side of the road and driven at speed through, residential areas, like really at speed. And so it's quite interesting because so all the oral evidence we got was really lackadaisical. But the written evidence was sitting there shouting at me. So the two other members of the tribunal were minded to just not continue the section and just let the guy leave. And it was just really interesting because I said, okay, that's fine, but you'll have to do that as a majority decision because I don't feel that that's the appropriate way to go. And in the past, and in other circumstances, I've watched other people doing this, people can get quite worked up about it. And it was really interesting because my two colleagues became very tense. They were not able to deal with the possibility that they would put in a majority decision rather than a unanimous decision. And so I just said, it's fine, but I'll just, I can give you the reasons and you can put them in the decision. And so I just went through the reasons, and they were both trying to persuade me to change my mind. And I said, no, it's fine. I'm quite relaxed. If he has to go out because it's a majority decision, that's fine. You are allowed to do that. That's part of the rules. And I didn't try to bother changing their mind, and they just asked me about the reasons. So I went through the reasons from the written evidence, and within 3 or 4 minutes, we had a unanimous decision to keep him in hospital. And it was really interesting because it was just very low key. I think possibly it was to do with just looping some of the things they were saying. I would say to them, so you were telling me, and I would just say what they'd said. And then I would just say, and if we look and see what it says in the written evidence, this is what it says. And it was just really interesting because it started off a bit tense. I wasn't very tense. I think I was too tired. It started off a bit tense, and then it ended up being a very sort of harmonious decision, as if they'd always thought that. And it was really interesting because I would put a lot of that down to the looping and keeping everything quiet and just thinking about the reasons for decisions.